One of the things I could see about my life before recovery is that it was almost like I felt like I was a bunch of fragmented pieces floating around in space. And there was space between those fragments, which meant other people's shit could leak into my territory. And for me, the process of recovery, especially building healthy boundaries in recovery, helped me to integrate those fragmented pieces into one coherent whole. And not only did I integrate those pieces into one coherent whole, I also got rid of the pieces that weren't legitimately and authentically me. Hi, I'm Barb Nangle. I want to welcome you to my podcast, Fragmented to Whole Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, where I help people heal their emotional, psychological, and spiritual wounds and make deep, lasting changes in their lives. I'm a boundaries coach who specializes in helping women who say yes when they really want to say no, and who neglect themselves because they're so focused on others. I've coached hundreds of people to create Boundaries by Design, a blueprint for life. I have a free boundary building starter kit at boundariesstarterkit.com. On this podcast, I share my experience, strength, and hope from recovery. I don't support or endorse any particular 12-step recovery fellowship, and I don't claim to speak for any 12-step fellowship. I don't believe that 12-step recovery is the only way to recover. You might need additional help. I'm an avid beachcomber and a formerly closeted fan of the Hallmark Channel, especially the Christmas movies. I wear fingerless gloves almost all year round because my hands are always cold, and I love taking pictures of license plates with my initials BN on them. My hope is that you'll find my words concretely helpful in improving your life, whether you're in recovery or not. If you like what you've heard on this episode, please screenshot it and share it on your social media. Be sure to tag me at Higher Power Coaching. This is episode 299, Why I Started Sharing Recovery Wisdom with the World. As I am preparing to record my 300th episode next week, I thought I would go back and tell the origin story, or perhaps I should say origin stories, of this podcast. I don't know about you, but I love a backstory. I'm not a huge superhero fan, but I've seen a number of superhero movies, and I love when I get to see the origin stories of how they got their superpowers and got to be where they are, etc. When I got laid off from Yale University in the summer of 2017, a series of serendipitous events led me into the world of entrepreneurship, startups, innovation, etc. at Yale and in New Haven. And I was like, oh my God, these are my people, just like the people in recovery are my people. There's a lot of overlap in the two worlds. You have to fall down 7 times and get up 8 when you're in recovery and when you're an entrepreneur, or you're not going to make it. You have to develop resilience. You have to believe that you can always get better. You have to surround yourself with people on the same journey because you know you can't do it alone. So I eventually decided to start my own business. And the same week that I made that decision, a friend of mine that I had met in ACA in a different state came to visit me, and I'd forgotten that she was a business coach, and she really helped me in a variety of ways, one of which was that she referred me to this woman. I think her name was Katie, and Katie was a coach. And my friend said, you should do at least a couple of coaching sessions with her to have her help you figure out what it is you want to do with your business. Now, it was pretty clear to me from the beginning that I wanted to be a coach and or a consultant. So Katie recommended that I start recording YouTube videos to just get my perspective about things out there. Now, I didn't really understand, why do I need to be on YouTube? Why do I need video? Because why do people need to see me? But I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to do whatever she says. So I bought a lavalier mic. I bought this little tripod thing. I found an adult ed training locally on how to create YouTube videos. So I went and I did that. And not long after that, a guy I know from the New Haven area who goes by the name Rev Kev approached me. He runs an audio and video studio, and he said he wanted to talk to me about a job opportunity. He said, he's going to start a podcast channel, and he wanted me to do the sales for the commercials for the podcast. And I was like, no, I am not a salesperson. Now, since I'd found my way into the world of entrepreneurships, startups, and innovation, it became clear that I am a natural connector. I cannot help myself. I am a networker by nature and a connector by nature. So I think he thought that was why I would be good at sales. Now, while we were having this conversation, he shared with me that he was going to have a podcast pitch event, that anybody who pitched an idea that he felt was worth pursuing, he would produce it for free for a certain period of time. So it wasn't like only one person's going to win the pitch event, like in most pitch events. And I was like, well, I don't want to do sales, but I think I want to do the pitch event. Now, the idea of a podcast made way more sense to me than YouTube videos. First of all, by then, I was really into podcasts, especially about recovery. And secondly, I continually had reflected back to me by my fellows in recovery that there was something about the way that I talked about my recovery and something about the way that I shared in meetings that was really helpful to other people. And I don't know what that is. I know I'm just talking. So I thought, well, I might as well record this stuff because I keep sharing with people in person or on the phone some of the same things. So I decided to do a pitch about a recovery podcast. And in thinking about what I wanted to call it, I had two different names in mind. So one was connecting the dots. And I came up with that phrase because I frequently had that phrase reflected back to me by my fellows in recovery all the time. They would say, Barb, you really help me connect the dots. You help me understand things. You help me understand myself. You help me understand recovery. So I thought maybe connecting the dots might be a good title. I also thought about the title Fragmented to Whole, which I will go into where that came from shortly. And everybody at the pitch event was like, connecting the dots could mean anything. Don't use that. Fragmented to whole is way more on point. Use that. So here's why I came up with the title Fragmented to Whole. One of the many, many gifts of my recovery experience is that I am now able to look back at my life before recovery and see things with crystal clarity. I could see, here's what I was doing, here's what I was thinking, and here's what my motives were. Meanwhile, back when that shit was happening, I was blind to it. One of the things I could see about my life before recovery is that it was almost like I felt like I was a bunch of fragmented pieces floating around in space. And there was space between those fragments, which meant other people's shit could leak into my territory. And for me, the process of recovery, especially building healthy boundaries in recovery, helped me to integrate those fragmented pieces into one coherent whole. And not only did I integrate those pieces into one coherent whole, I also got rid of the pieces that weren't legitimately and authentically me. So one of the ways we talk about that in my ACA program is in promise number 1 of that program, which is we will discover our real identity. I personally discovered or / created my real identity by building healthy boundaries. I discovered my real identity by getting rid of the pieces that were not authentically me. I discovered what I liked and didn't like, what I wanted and needed and preferred, what was okay with me and not okay with me, what was my responsibility and what was other people's responsibility. That is the boundaries of Barb. Like, where do I end and other people begin? And I also integrated my fragments into one coherent whole through the boundary building process. So now I can be rocked by things that happen to me, but I can no longer be shattered by them because I am whole. I'm not a bunch of fragments any longer. Now, you may be asking, how did I get to be fragmented? And I think there's many reasons for that, but two specifically come to mind. One is I lied all the fucking time. I was out of integrity. I lied about smoking cigarettes. I lied about drugs, alcohol, relationships. I lied about using birth control, but mostly I lied for people-pleasing reasons. I constantly said things were okay with me when they were not. People would ask, how you doing? And I'd be like, I'm fine, when no, I wasn't. They'd ask, do you need help? And I'd say, no, I don't need help, when yes, I did need help. I'd say that I liked things that I didn't. I was dishonest all over the place. And yet I truly believed that I was an honest person. I thought I was a woman of integrity, and I was not. So being out of integrity, which by the way, integrity is another word for wholeness, that led to my fragmentation, being out of integrity. Another way I believe I became fragmented is that I had all these different masks or facades up as a way to protect myself from being judged or abandoned or rejected by other people. And what I learned through the process of recovery is that rather than having these fake masks up as a way to protect myself, is that I can actually learn how to build healthy boundaries and use them to protect me instead of these masks. So here are a few examples of the masks or fake identities that I had. One of them was, I can afford this. Every single financial problem I ever had was due to my codependence and wanting people to like or approve of me. So I was doing things like buying people's affection or trying to manage my image with them because I didn't want them to judge me or would think less of me. I was rescuing, fixing, and saving them with money. Another mask I had was, I have my shit together. Now, I actually do have my shit together in many respects, but I try to act like 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, in every single circumstance, at all times, I have my shit together, and that's just not realistic. But I didn't want people to see behind the mask. I didn't want them to know I made mistakes, that I have flaws, that I sometimes didn't know what the fuck I was doing, or I didn't have the answer for everything. Another mask was I would be like, I like what you like, really. So I tried to be a chameleon and I was proud of it. So whatever you liked was fine with me. So the example that I share with my clients is I have been a Dallas Cowboys fan twice. I've been a New York Giants fan, and I've been a New England Patriots fan. Meanwhile, I don't really give a shit about football. But I felt that to be a good girlfriend, I had to be a fan of these football teams. So I had all of these different masks up. And when you have a bunch of different masks or facades up, you become fragmented. So it really made sense for me to entitle this podcast Fragmented to Whole: Life Lessons from 12-Step Recovery, because it describes what my experience of recovery was. I went from fragmented to whole, and who does not want to be whole? Now, the reason I wanted to share the things I learned in recovery on a podcast was not just because I got feedback from other people that the way I talk about recovery is helpful, but because I have been a seeker my entire adult life. I started going to therapy when I was probably 15, and I was 52 when I got in recovery. So that's 37 years of therapy, not continuous, but damn close. I got introduced to the whole self-help and personal development genre when I was like 22 or 23 years old, and have read voraciously in that genre, and I still do. I started collecting inspirational quotes around that same time, and now I have a Word document that's something like 70 pages with quotes that I've been collecting that are inspirational and motivational. I have done workshops and work groups and workbooks and retreats and seminars and spiritual groups and physical fitness and health and you name it. I did all the things. I've also taken just about every personality assessment out there, and all of that shit together just barely scratched the surface of the iceberg of my life, whereas 12-step recovery melted the iceberg of my life. I continue to grow a lot in recovery, but the growth I experienced in my first 2 to 3 years in recovery were just astronomical. And so I was like, what the hell is going on in this world that there is all this wisdom, life skills, tips, tricks, and mindset shifts in 12-step recovery that are just not making its way out into the rest of the world? There are so many concepts I learned in recovery that I never heard of ever before. And I had been trying my entire adult life and barely experienced any change, whereas I was deeply and profoundly changed by 12-step recovery. And I wanted that wisdom to get out into the world. So that's another reason why I started the podcast. Now, it never occurred to me in the beginning that the podcast would have anything to do with my business. I was not a boundaries coach at the very beginning. Initially, I wanted to coach people in recovery who were small business owners because by then I knew both of these groups were my people. So I figured people who are both are really my people. And I tried to do that for a while. And I realized, one, I'm not a business coach, so that doesn't really make sense. And two, some people don't really want people to know that they're in recovery. But I knew I had to have some kind of niche, and you can't just be a generalized life coach because if you try to market to everybody, you market to nobody. So I started working with a new coach, and she helped me realize that becoming a boundaries coach really made sense for me for a few reasons. Number one, I think of my core wound as codependence, and boundaries are essentially the antidote to codependence. And also, boundaries permeate every single area of your life. So they permeate your relationships, your finances, your health, your hobbies. Boundaries are everywhere. So when you clean up your boundaries, you have the potential to impact every single area of your life, which is exactly what happened to me. Also, I have lived experience that makes me a great boundaries coach. I lived for 50 something years with no boundaries. And now I have such healthy boundaries that I'm a boundaries coach. So I know what it feels like in my body to not have healthy boundaries. And I know what it feels like in my body to have healthy boundaries. And by the way, having healthy boundaries is a way more pleasant and peaceful way to inhabit your body. Now, because of my lived experience, I'm able to articulate what the emotional experience of not having boundaries is so people can recognize, I see you, I hear you, I was you. And I'm able to articulate what it is emotionally to experience having boundaries so I can give people hope. If I've made this transition, you can too. And I'm also able to teach people how to build healthy boundaries from the standpoint of someone who's done it. I personally learned to build healthy boundaries through a meandering, haphazard path through the 12 steps of recovery. It's not like someone sat me down and was like, okay, Barb, we're going to build boundaries now, and this is what you do. That is not what happened. I sort of ended up realizing like, oh, these are boundaries and I have them now, and this is amazing. Now, once I got how awesome having boundaries was, I started doing some reading about them and retroactively understood, oh, this is what was going on. And as I was reading these books about boundaries, I started drawing these visuals like circles, etc., to visually depict what I was reading about when it came to boundaries, because I'm a visual person. And those drawings turned into handouts, which turned into a workbook, which is now the backbone of my boundaries coaching program. I have since created an entire multimedia curriculum and an accelerated process by which people can learn how to build healthy boundaries in a matter of weeks through a structured process. So they don't have to take 2 to 3 years like I did, and they don't have to do this meandering, haphazard path like I did. Instead, they get a structured process. None of that shit was going on when I started. I had no freaking idea what I was doing in the beginning. When I started with my podcast, I knew almost nothing about business. I knew nothing about marketing and niches, and I really didn't know much about podcasting. I stumbled my way here, learning as I went along. Doing this podcast has been an absolutely incredible growth journey for me. Now that I'm in recovery, I show up for myself in a way I never did before. The fact that I can consistently do a weekly podcast for 300 weeks means that I now have the ability to follow through for myself in a way I never did before. So now I want to shift gears and tell you something else about the origin of my podcast. It turns out that the seed for this podcast was planted probably 30 something years ago, but I didn't know it. I discovered this a couple of years into recording my podcast. What happened was that I heard from 3 different people inside of 1 year something like this. They said, if you have a desire in you that you've had for a very long time, that desire was planted in you by the universe. And that desire is going to come to fruition at some point, somewhere. Hopefully, it will come through you, but if not, it will come through someone else. And this explains why sometimes 2 different people will invent or discover the same thing at approximately the same time, or you'll have an idea and then someday you'll be like, oh my God, somebody stole my idea. And that's because the desire has been planted by the universe. Now, as I thought about this, I was like, oh my God, this happened to me. So here's what I mean. I started listening to books on tape when they were on a cassette, and I would listen to them with a Walkman, and I would only allow myself to do it when I was walking because I knew that I would get myself to walk because I wanted to listen to more of the book. And I thought that I needed to force myself to exercise to maintain or lose weight. So I'd only listen while I was walking, but every single time I would listen, I always thought, oh my God, I want to someday narrate books on tape. Now, when I moved to New Haven in 2001, I ended up volunteering for 5 years for an organization called Reading for the Blind and Dyslexic. And I did it because I just love to read aloud and I'd always wanted to do that. And I figured, why not do it for people who can benefit that can't read without the audio? So fast forward, I'm in the world of entrepreneurship, I'm networking, and I meet a woman who tells me that she narrates audiobooks. And I was like, oh my God, how are you doing that? How did you learn how to do it? And she said, here, read this book and it will tell you everything you need to know to start. So I get the book. I download Audacity, which is a free software program for recording. I get a good microphone, I get a set of headphones, and then I go to Audible, or maybe it's ACX, I think is what it's called. And I do all this kind of stuff, and I end up emptying a closet in my basement and insulating it and start working on the audiobooks in that as my quote studio. Not long after, I realized this sucks. It's only a very small percentage of the time that I'm actually narrating the books, which is the part I like. Most of my time was either doing the technical stuff with the Audacity program or searching for books to narrate, etc. So a few weeks into me doing that is when Rev Kev approached me about the whole podcast thing. For the first 3 episodes of my podcast, I actually drove downtown to New Haven to his studio and recorded my episodes in his studio. And after the 3rd one, I was like, wait a minute, I have a fucking studio in my basement. Can I just record them and email them to you? And he was like, absolutely, because it's going to save us both time. So that meant I didn't have to drive downtown and find a parking space, blah, blah, blah. And he didn't have to sit in the studio with me while I recorded and then again listen to it while he produced it. So I started doing the podcast in my basement studio. And now I actually record, and in fact, at this very moment, I am in my bedroom closet upstairs because at one point my neighbors were doing construction in their basement and it was so loud I couldn't record down there. So I just did it in my closet upstairs. And I was like, this is way easier. And this means I can have my basement closet back. So it didn't take me long to quit the audiobook thing because I hated it, especially in contrast to podcasting. And when I looked back on all this, I realized, oh my God, the universe planted the desire for me to be a podcaster in me so long ago that podcasting didn't even exist as a technology. So the universe cleverly disguised that desire as the desire to narrate audiobooks rather than be a podcaster, because I wouldn't have known what that was. And I was like, oh my God, There really is something to this notion that if the universe plants a desire in you, it is going to come to fruition in you unless you block it. So if you have had a lifelong desire for something, I really encourage you to pursue it. Don't block it. Now, what I've learned as an entrepreneur is that the number one thing that stops people from bringing an idea into the world, whether it's for a business or a hobby or a creative endeavor, is that they can't figure out how they're going to make it happen. Here's the secret. You don't need to know how. It's your job to know what you want to do and why you want to do it. It's the universe's job to determine how and when. So don't worry about how, because if you just keep at it, take the next step in faith, go as far as you can see, and when you get there, you can see farther. Go in the direction of the desire and just don't stop. You will eventually get there. So as I said, I didn't know what the fuck I was doing. I stumbled my way through my podcast and through my business. People say things like, oh my God, if I start now, I'm going to be fucking 50 when I finish with whatever. Well, guess what? That time is going to go by anyway. So you might as well let it pass while you're pursuing your desire. One thing that I like to add about this podcast is that at the beginning, I was super concerned about not violating the traditions of 12-step recovery, which actually they're 12-step and 12 tradition programs. If you're not in 12-step recovery, you don't really need to know what that means. Don't worry about it. But if you are in 12-step recovery, you know that the traditions guide our behavior. And what changed for me was that 2 to 3 years ago, I was a guest on the Adult Child podcast with Andrea Ashley. Shout out to Andrea. That's my favorite podcast. So that meant that I came out publicly as an adult child. That podcast is way bigger than mine and way more people listen to it. And it was such a relief to be able to talk publicly about my adult child recovery, because it's not exactly the same as other 12-step recovery. And I ended up just starting to share on my podcast about being in ACA, and then I started sharing about being in OA. And I got a lot of really great feedback from people, and I decided I can live with violating the traditions, which means I'm publicly identifying as a member of these groups. That's one of the reasons why I say at the beginning, I don't speak for or represent any particular program of recovery, because I don't. So I just want to acknowledge that part of the journey of this podcast is coming out as not just a member of 12-step recovery in general, but as a member of adult children of alcoholics and dysfunctional families, as a member of Overeaters Anonymous, and as a former member of Codependents Anonymous. So that is the origin story or stories of Fragmented to Whole life lessons from 12-step recovery. What I found is that professional women are afraid people won't like them, so they don't say no. Then they become overwhelmed and resentful because they keep giving in to others and take on too much. What they really want is to have balanced relationships where there's give and take without having to have a confrontation. But they think the problem is that if they knew just the right words to say, things would go more smoothly and they'd be able to stick to their boundaries. So they end up letting people walk all over them and then explode when they can't take it anymore. But the real problem is that they don't know what's okay with them and not okay with them because they're so focused on others. That means they don't set limits or ask for help. What they need to do is focus internally to get clear on what matters to them so they know what to say no to and can communicate that clearly with calm confidence. If this sounds like you, we should talk. Go to barbchat.net to sign up for a call with me. If you like this podcast, and I'm guessing you did because you're still listening, you will also love my weekly newsletter, Friday Fragments, which has short essays similar to the podcast. You can check it out at fridayfragments.news. That's fridayfragments.news. If you haven't already subscribed to my podcast on your favorite podcast outlet, please do that. It helps carry the message to more people. I started this podcast because there was so much wisdom in recovery that just wasn't making its way out into the world. So I want as many people as possible to hear it. I'd also love it if you'd leave a 5-star rating or a review, which you can do on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find it so they can get the benefits that you've gotten from listening. If someone in particular came to mind when you listen to this episode, please share it with them. And my favorite place to hang out on social media is Instagram. I'm at Higher Power Coaching. Please DM me there. I'd love to hear what you got from this episode. I run private and group coaching programs on building healthy boundaries. Whether you need help with boundaries in your personal, professional, or romantic life, I can help. Head on over to barbchat.net where you can get on my calendar for a free 30-minute Better Boundaries consultation. I also do short-term situational coaching to help people make it through specific situations they're going through, such as divorce, empty nesting, preparing for retirement, or any phase where their identity is shifting. Regardless of the type of coaching, my ideal client is someone who is ripe for change. If that's you, I'd love to work with you. My goal with all my work is to help you make lasting changes in your life, like I've made deep, lasting changes in my life. Remember, it's never too late to recover. No one is beyond hope, and healing is possible. Thanks for listening.